Life has a strange way of bringing people together in the most unexpected moments. One evening, Marcus, a hard-working black man, was walking home when he was stopped by a police officer. The encounter was harsh, unfair, humiliating, and something Marcus had sadly experienced before. The officer, rigid with authority, dismissed his dignity and left him feeling powerless. But fate had something else in store. Days later, a tragic accident turned the tables. That same officer found himself in a life-or-death situation, trapped and desperate for help. And the only person who could save him, Marcus. Without hesitation, Marcus ran toward danger, risking everything for the man who had once looked down on him. What happened next left everyone speechless. The officer, overwhelmed with gratitude, did something no one expected. He dropped to his knees. But was it enough to erase the past? Stay tuned to find out. As Marcus pulled the officer to safety, the smell of burning metal filled the air. The wrecked police car was seconds away from catching fire, but Marcus didn't think twice. He just acted. The officer, barely conscious, coughed as he looked up at the man who had just saved his life. A man he had treated unfairly not long ago. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence, their eyes shifting between the two men. Some whispered, recognizing Marcus from the incident before. Others recorded on their phones, sensing this was a moment that would not be forgotten. But Marcus wasn't thinking about that. His hands trembled, his heart pounded, and he could barely believe what had just happened. The officer, struggling to breathe, suddenly did something no one expected. He reached for Marcus's hand, his face filled with something unfamiliar. Regret. Then slowly, he fell to his knees. But why? For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The officer, still on his knees, gripped Marcus's hand like a lifeline. His breathing was uneven, his eyes filled with something Marcus couldn't quite read. Was it shock, guilt, or something deeper? The same man who had once humiliated him now sat vulnerable before him, surrounded by flashing lights and murmuring onlookers. Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could still hear the officer's harsh words from days before echoing in his mind, the way he had been treated as if he were nothing. And yet, here they were. The irony was impossible to ignore. Did saving this man mean he had to forgive him? Did this moment change anything? The officer swallowed hard, still gripping Marcus's hand. Why? He finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked down at him, his jaw tightening. He had a choice to make, but what came next was something no one expected. Marcus took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the officer kneeling before him. The weight of everything that had happened between them hung in the air, thick with unspoken words. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity growing. Some had witnessed their first encounter, the way the officer had treated Marcus with cold authority. Now, seeing the roles reversed, they waited to see what Marcus would do. The officer's face was pale, a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, remorse, maybe even shame. His uniform, once a symbol of control, was now torn and stained with dirt and sweat. "Why did you save me?" he asked again, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus clenched his fists, the memory of that humiliating night flashing through his mind. He had every reason to walk away, to let this man face the consequences of his actions. But instead, he bent down slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. "Because that's what a good man does," he said, his voice steady. The officer blinked, his breath hitching. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could, sirens blared louder, and paramedics rushed in. The moment was slipping away, but the question still lingered. Was this a moment of change, or would things remain the same? Before the paramedics could reach him, the officer suddenly grabbed Marcus's wrist, his grip weak but desperate. His eyes darted around as if searching for the right words. "I need to tell you something," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Marcus hesitated. The man was in pain, barely holding himself up, yet there was an urgency in his voice that made Marcus stay. The officer struggled to sit up, wincing. That night, I wasn't just doing my job. I was following orders. His breathing was labored, but he forced himself to continue. There's more to it. More than you know. Marcus's stomach tightened. What was he trying to say? The crowd, the flashing lights, the distant voices all seemed to fade as Marcus focused on the man in front of him. He had spent days trying to forget what happened, pushing down the anger, the humiliation. But now it seemed there was something else, something bigger that he hadn't seen before. The officer's hand slipped, his strength fading fast. The paramedics finally reached him, pushing Marcus aside as they worked to stabilize him. "Wait," Marcus said, stepping forward. "What do you mean? What else is there?" But the officer's eyes were already fluttering shut, his body giving in to exhaustion. The medics lifted him onto a stretcher, moving quickly toward the ambulance. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. The man who had once humiliated him, the same man who had just thanked him on his knees, had one more secret left to tell. And now Marcus had to find out the truth. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding as the ambulance doors slammed shut. The officer's last words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, there's more to it. More than you know, asterisk, what did he mean? What had really happened that night? Hours later, Marcus found himself at the hospital, pacing the waiting room. He didn't know why he was still there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. He told himself he didn't care. But the truth was, he needed answers. When a nurse finally nodded him in, Marcus hesitated before stepping through the door. The officer lay in the bed, hooked up to machines, his face pale but awake. He turned his head slowly. "You came," he said weakly. Marcus crossed his arms. "You said there was more. I want to know." The officer sighed, staring at the ceiling. "That night, I was ordered to stop you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because of who you are." Marcus frowned. "What are you talking about?" The officer swallowed hard. "There was an investigation. Your name was flagged, but not for the reason you think. Someone higher up didn't want you speaking out about something bigger." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was told to make sure you stayed quiet." Marcus's blood ran cold. He had suspected the stop was unfair, but this was something else. His hands curled into fists. "So you followed orders, humiliated me, and now you expect me to just forget?" The officer shook his head. "No, I expect you to listen, because I didn't know the full story until after I stopped you. And when I did, I realized I had made a mistake, a big one." Marcus took a step closer. "What mistake?" The officer looked him straight in the eye, the kind that puts both of us in danger. At that moment, the hospital intercom buzzed, calling for security. Heavy footsteps approached the room. The officer's breathing quickened. "They don't want me talking to you. If you want the truth, you have to leave. Now." Marcus's pulse raced. He had come for closure, but now he had stumbled into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. As the footsteps got louder, he realized this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Marcus hesitated for a split second, then turned and walked out of the hospital room just as the doors swung open behind him. He didn't need to look back to know the officer had been right. Someone didn't want this conversation to happen. His mind raced as he stepped into the night air, the city lights flickering around him. The truth was bigger than he had expected, and now he had a choice. He could walk away, pretend none of this ever happened, or he could dig deeper, find out why his name had been flagged and who was behind it. As he took a deep breath, Marcus realized something. No matter how unfair life had been, he had chosen to save that man, not for recognition, not for forgiveness, but because he refused to be like those who had wronged him. And that was his real victory. With one last glance at the hospital, he walked away, ready for whatever came next.